You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to another edition of Radio MMT. How are you, Anne?
I'm doing all right, Kev. Hello to you and hello to our lovely listener. Thanks for joining us as we wander through all things MMT and economic.
And welcome, and individually, each one of you, because that's good radio, Anne.
And I was wondering, Kevin, speaking of how you are, do we have any reports from the man in a van from the last couple of weeks?
Oh, not really, except there's this thing where occasionally people... individuals will come and question me, concerned citizens. It's happened to me about 3 times, and there's a theme.
Oh, yes.
Theme running. So this has happened to me a couple of times on the New South Wales coast. And so at the moment I'm visiting my ex. The first thing that we did when we moved into the house in 1992 was I built the front porch, and it's deteriorated. Now, I've been separated and have moved out of the home 15 years ago. But apparently the porch comes with a lifetime guarantee. So my ex-wife tells me the marriage didn't come with a lifetime guarantee, but the front porch comes with
there, got
a lifetime
your priorities
guarantee.
Right.
So I'm parked back out the front of my former house, and there's a guy who lives up on the corner who's an ex-cop, and he said, "You have to always park your van there." It's ex-cops. He's the third ex-cop that's told me to move on.
Oh, that's the theme, is it?
That's the theme. Ex-cops like to tell me to move on.
Okay, the ex-cops doing their bit for society.
They have trouble letting go of their jobs sometimes, I think. He's a nice fella, Tony, if you're listening. Hey, Radiothon's coming up. The next show will be Radiothon. Just getting the listeners, whether you're a live listener or a podcast listener, you know the state of the world just as well as we do. It's devoid of money in the right places.
That's right.
The rich people have gotten richer and the poor people have gotten poorer. We're in the poor category with 3CR, and we need all the help we can get. So we're going to be hitting you up soon. So just think about that. If you need to start saving your 50-cent pieces or something, that's coming up at the next episode. So
it's going to be a fun show, Radiothon. We might answer a few questions from listeners.
Oh, yeah. Hey, shall we talk about recent events?
Do tell.
This is kind of interesting because it has to do with the environment, and the environment has collected so many political scalps over the last decade or so. You know, if you were too environmentally concerned, you got done. Malcolm Turnbull was too environmentally concerned, and he got his throat slit by his party members, and now it's gone completely the other way around. So now the Nationals are really anti-environment. They're all nuclear and sceptical and want to thrash targets, etc. So the fallout of that is that the Liberal Party have lost their urban vote, suburban vote, the inner city vote, because inner city people are concerned about the environment. And the reason for this is that the Liberal Party, to regain their voting base, which has been slipping off to the Teals, who are environmentally conscious, kind of like Liberals who believe in a free market economy, but they also believe that climate change is a real thing. There's nothing to stop the Liberal Party from fitting that profile. That's where they used to be. Anyway, so if you had the Liberals, the Greens and Labor all competing for the better environment policies, that would be a very good thing. And then we could tell them how they could achieve this through our MMT knowledge of the fiscal capacity of the government.
Exactly, that the government can't run out of the Australian dollars.
To achieve their ends, And I was going to try and infiltrate the Teals,
Yes.
right? And so then that would undermine any of the arguments that the Liberals would have had, and I could have changed the world.
You could have.
Yeah.
You were so close.
Anyway, as soon as the Nationals realised that they weren't going to get any seats on the shadow cabinet, they said, "Oh, hang on, we've changed our mind. We like you again, and let's all be friends again."
Yeah, it's been a bit of a drama playing out in the media.
Which means that the coalition will not be in power for a very long time. So that means we have to put as much pressure on Labor as we possibly can during this very stable period of government that they're going to enjoy to make significant change, primarily to the environment. And we can tell them that they are able to spend as much as they need to, so long as the real resources to address the issues that they have are available.
Yeah, I'd love to see them heading for a steady state economy.
Yeah, simple. Now, I've got something on my phone, and I'm going to have to find it for a second.
Okay.
Can you fill in with some background dancing or something? Because this is a quote. This is a quote from Anthony Albanese. This kind of shows you where Labor's at with their view on the economy. So this is Albanese. He says, and I quote, "We see there is a role for the state in improving people's lives, but we also very much believe in markets, and that markets are a democratic mechanism as well. I believe in the private sector being the key driver of growth, but the public sector should step in where there is market failure." So he sees government intervention in the economy as a safeguard, not a driver. So now we refer to this as neo-Labourism.
Is that something you made up? Or
No.
that's what people are calling it?
This is floating around the place. This is a real thing.
Well, he's left himself a pretty big loophole there, because when you talk about market failure, I'd say global warming is an example of market failure.
Exactly. Yeah. And look, and as we know, the government spending is incredibly important for the private sector. We might segue into my next topic now, which is I've become very interested in the Costello years. This is for our very intelligent listener to give us some feedback on. So in previous episodes, what I've said is that this is an MMT understanding of the economy, is that all the money in the private sector comes from government deficits, and that money is accessed either through saving past deficits or accessing the savings that you're going to make in the future through bank credit. Government's spending into the economy and then leaving some of it there as a deficit, and that becomes the public asset. The money that the government leaves in the economy is
Private sector savings.
private sector savings. It's private sector surplus. And so on that basis, if the government ever cleared the entire debt, not just a deficit, but all the previous deficits, my expectation would be that the economy would collapse. The only problem is they did this in 2006. They brought the government debt to zero in 2006 and then got voted out in 2007. And so I understood that Costello ran a number of surpluses, but I didn't realise that he actually cleared the national debt.
Wow.
So what that means in a technical term is that when a government runs a deficit, it then issues bonds.
To match the amount that they've spent, that is the deficit.
Yes, and they pretend that the bonds are funding. The government spending. They're not. So in 2006, the Howard Costello government had repaid all of the bonds in existence.
Oh.
And the economy didn't collapse.
No.
So either I'm wrong or there's more to this.
There must be more to it.
And if I'm wrong, I like being wrong. If somebody can explain to me while I'm wrong, I learn something. That's good.
Part of it too, I think, is what we're calling the debt are those savings that have been converted into bonds. And the thing that happens when the government redeems all the bonds is they turn the bonds back into cash. So the money that the government has spent is now sitting in the economy in the form of cash rather than in the form of bonds.
Yeah, okay. So there's a couple of things going on here. What we had during the Howard years was a massive asset sale off. They sold the remainder of the Commonwealth Bank. They sold Telstra, which was Telecom at the time. I think they sold all the gold that was being held by Fort Knox in the US because we've gone off the gold standard and there's a huge supply of gold there. So when they came into office in 1996, they inherited a $96 billion debt from previous governments through till whenever. But they had asset sales worth $72 billion. So it's not like they collected $72 billion in tax They sold $72 billion worth of public assets, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because they don't need the money, as you and I and any MMT understand. Or any
That's the tragedy of it all. Like the way they undercut the idea that we would have fibre to the home.
Yeah.
And they didn't do it because it was going to cost too much. That's just utter tragedy, because the government could have found the dollars. It wasn't the dollars that was the problem.
It was the ideology. However, we've still got $72 billion being transferred from the private sector back to the government sector. They've bought things. That's money going from the private sector back to the government sector. So that's money extinguished in essence.
Yes.
So that money has left the private sector, and then it was a particularly booming time during the 90s. And so there was a lot of money kicking around, and there's a lot of taxes being paid on that money. So the remainder of the deficit, so you got 96 minus 72 equals something, and whatever that something is, was received in a booming economy with taxes and royalties from a minerals explosion. It was like a perfect storm of all this money coming back in. How much money did they drain? I'm going to use a house as a practical example, because this makes pretty good sense. You could buy a house in the mid-90s for $100,000, and that house now would be worth $1.5 to $2 million. So you have an asset which is now worth $1.5 to $2 million, but it only cost you $100,000. So if you paid off that debt from the past, you only have to pay off $100,000, and you've got on the books something that's worth $1.5 to $2 million. So the government debt, like the big drain on the government in the past was World War II. I think it might have cost $10 million or something like that. Like it was way out of control compared to anything else. But a bit like that. What's the movie? The Spy Who Shagged Me. And you've got Dr. Evil, and he's been frozen for an amount of time, and then he comes back and he says, "You need to do what I say, otherwise I'm going to blow up the world. You need to send me $1 million." And his son looks at him like he's an idiot and says, $1 million? You can't even get a house for that. So the point being that the previous debt has been scaled right back because of inflation over the years. So paying off the past debt is not that big a deal. Paying off World War II in the year 2000 or 2005 is a minor blip on your radar. So you've got a past government debt that in real terms is not that big. It was $96 billion. It's not much at all. So the Costello and Howard, they're crowing about their financial achievements. And it didn't seem to be a particularly hard time. So things had kind of taken off in 96 through to 2007. And it seemed like a buoyant time. So the government has drained the entire debt, and things are booming. It doesn't make sense.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
So we understand where the money came from. What we then need to try and understand is how come the economy didn't collapse. The other thing you had was that people were spending, as we said before, people spend either their savings that they've accumulated, or they spend the savings that they're expecting in the future through private debt. So private debt went through the roof.
Right.
So essentially people shifted their spending habits from what they'd acquired to what they were thinking that they were going to acquire in the future. Now, this is the very same time that the Hawke-Keating government had deregulated the banks and the Howard government let them run. So the banks are running right. And we saw this in the Banking Royal Commission afterwards. They are lending money to anyone. And like they said back in the day, I remember this quite specifically, they were saying, like, if you owe the bank money, you've got a problem. If you owe the bank a lot of money, they've got a problem. And you saw, the Scases and the Bondies and all these people taking out these massive loans and coming a cropper. So it was a big unregulated market, and there's stuff going everywhere. And what gets me is that we understand that banks lend against future savings, and those future savings are derived from future government deficits. So if you're a bank and you could see the government running surpluses and bringing the debt down and having this really tight spending regime, I would be really worried if I was a loans officer. But the culture of the time was the complete opposite. It was, the government's running a really good fiscal policy, which is to say they're reducing debt. So let's just keep on lending out because we're in a really good position.
Well, there's so much cognitive dissonance that goes on with that, isn't there? Because I think there was some kind of inquiry or committee that looked into the problem that they suddenly realised that they had no reason to issue bonds. And the financial market, of course, wants the bonds because it gives them a free stream of secure income.
Yeah, that was a very interesting episode, wasn't it? These financial institutions, the superannuation companies and other large investors, when all the bonds dried up, said, we need bonds. And that told you the real purpose of bonds.
But I think the reason, there's so many different things feeding into this, but the thing that helps me think about it is to think about that debt is a worry when it's a private sector debt, but it's not a worry when it's the federal government debt. So any non-federal government entity that has a debt, they do have to find some way of paying it back, whereas the federal government doesn't really have anything called a debt because it can always issue more Australian dollars. So if you're saying that the government paid down its debt, I think what we're saying is that it converted the bonds back into cash, and it probably, the thing is whether it pulled out some of the money supply as well. But as you say, what was compensating for that at the time was the private, especially households, going deeper and deeper into debt. And the economists of all different stripes, they all try and figure out what is this boom and bust cycle that the economy has, and what was this big bust in 2007, 8, 9, the GFC. And our kinds of economists will say, you look at what the private sector debt is doing, and that will tell you how stable or unstable the economy is, despite these good times that you were describing.
Yeah, and what we also know from that period is that as soon as 2007 we had a change of government, the government spent into the economy far more than it taxed out on a scale not seen before after
Right.
2007. And this is where I'm a kind of a bit annoyed by the GFC, because the GFC is like it's a global thing. But
Yeah.
can you imagine what would have happened to the Australian economy had the Howard Costello government lasted another term?
It would have gone into
2007.
recession.
Yeah, it would have been serious. There would have been a complete strangle on money that was available. You would have seen banks foreclosing on loans at a much higher rate because the money just would not have been in the economy to sustain it.
Yeah, I think our economists were predicting that the economy was going to hit a wall, but then the GFC came along and that forced the government to spend.
Yeah, so under the smokescreen of the GFC, the Howard Costello government can crow about their enormous fiscal successes.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
And that's the only measure of success. If you look at it from the resource side of the economy, it was not a success. If you look at, say, the issue of domestic violence, if you look at the increasing extinction rate of mammals in Australia, if you look at all the actual real stuff that's going on, you'll see a lot of indicators where Australia was going backwards because the government was not spending.
Yeah, certainly from my own personal experience, it was during that period around 2008, 2009, where I was employed as a trades assistant for Sparkies, and this is when the Rudd and Swan government, Wayne Swan as Treasurer, initiated this big schools kind of spend, and we went to these schools and they were so run down. They were just they hadn't any money spent on it. And this is due to the kind of
tightening from the government not spending.
Yeah. Anyway, so I communicated with a prominent economist and asked him this question. And he said, "Dear Kevin, two things prevented the economy from going into deep recession in the wake of the fiscal contraction that Costello introduced." He says, one, the scale of the private debt which sustained consumption spending. In 1995, household debt to disposable income was around 70%. By the end of Costello's run, it was around 180%. It was facilitated by the financial market deregulation that Hawke and Keating engineered. And he said, two, then in the last half or so of that period, the external terms of trade boomed. The once in 100 years mining boom, which saw export revenue boost aggregate spending and maintain GDP growth such that the tax revenue kept coming in to deliver his surpluses. The legacy was massive profits for the foreign mining companies and a massive debt overhanging for households. That's the
summary
from somebody who is far more
who knows what they're talking about.
Well, somebody who reads a lot of stats and does that stuff. So I am going to kind of go into this again. It might be a couple of months. But
I do like the way you follow logic to its extreme end, Kevin.
Yeah, well, okay. So we'd love any feedback from our learned listeners who might be able to add some information to this. You can email us at radiommt@gmail.com
and
give us any information on this. Or it could just be that I'm completely wrong, that if the government clears its debt, it's not a huge problem, but I don't think so. I don't think I'm wrong.
3CR's annual Radiothon fundraiser is almost here.
This June we'll be asking for your donations to support 3CR.
Your donation during Radiothon keeps the station radical and enables us to give voice to our community for another year.
All donations over $2 are tax deductible.
3CR Radiothon is coming. Show your support by donating this June.
3CR, your station, your voice.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
What else have we got for this show, Anne?
Well, I thought we would stick with the theme of extremes here, Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
A few episodes we did hear from Australia's richest woman, Gina Reinhardt, and I remember her joking about how she wanted to make our bank accounts great again.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think they were your bank accounts or mine.
She could just share. That would help.
That's true. So I thought we would go to the other extreme, Kevin, and meet a woman who wants to live with no money at all. And this woman is Jo Nemeth, and she lives and works in a 9-person household in Lismore. And in a moment, we will hear Jo Nemeth speaking with The Guardian's Rejid Ahmed about how she manages to live without money, which she has been doing for the past 10 years. And this conversation is an excerpt from an episode of the podcast The Full Story, which is produced by Guardian Australia. That episode was titled, Could You Live Without Money? And it aired on the 25th of February 2025.
I'm Rejid Ahmed, coming to you from Gadigal land, and this is The Full Story. Today, Jo speaks to us about her great no-money experiment.
I work quite hard, I work 10-hour days, 5 days a week, and I work a lot harder than I did before. I usually am up at 6:30. I let the chooks out, I feed the dogs, then I feed the grandbabies, and then I clean up the kitchen, and then I usually go outside and do some jobs, like I'm growing food here, so there's always jobs in the garden to do. There might be jobs with the chooks to do, there's composting to do. I make a lot of things like our own soap, our own tofu. I make apple scrap vinegar. I make a fermented drink. Washing clothes. There's lots of jobs. I'm like a kind of a housewife, really. But I prefer the term radical homesteader because it's I have a very specific reason for doing this and a specific mission, I guess, and that is to reduce the consumption of the household. I had just been learning a lot about the impacts that my lifestyle was having on the biosphere and on people all over the planet, people who I'd never meet, because of our long supply chains in our globalized economic system. So money can be quite destructive, or buying things, is a very destructive thing because of the way that the economic system is set up. We are good people and we don't believe in hurting other people, but when we buy things, we are hurting other people. We are hurting our children.
Because of the manufacturing process?
Because of the mining, the manufacturing, the transport, the processing, the factories, people not being paid a living wage. If you look through the supply chains of pretty much any good that you buy from the shops, and you really dig deeply into what went into bringing that product to you from its beginning to its end, even after you've finished with it, it's pretty horrendous. It was really getting to me. I was feeling very sad, very distressed. My paycheck was barely covering the cost of living at that time, and that was back in 2014. I was reading a book one day in February 2014, and in this book they mentioned somebody who had chosen, somebody in the Western world like myself had chosen to live without money. And that was when the penny dropped, I like to say. Initially, 10 years ago, I was hoping that when people heard about what I was doing, that they might think more deeply about their own consumption. I'm not sure that that's happened as much as I would like. And, you know, everyone around me is locked into, and me to a certain extent as well, locked into this massive globalised system that's violent, you know. And so it's very hard to break out of that. Even for me, there's still areas like doing what I'm doing now, talking to you on my daughter's laptop and using Zoom. I mean, that's still part of that system. I think that we're headed for disaster.
And you're talking about the climate crisis.
Well, that's what I used to think. It was just climate crisis, but now there are so many, there are multi-crises, like there are so many things that are happening, including, you know, nuclear war, pandemics, the whole lot. Economic collapse, I think, is probably the most likely in the near-term future. So at first I was living quite independently, so I would grow food on the farm that I was living on, or I helped to grow food for birthdays and Christmas. That's when I asked for things that I couldn't grow or get hold of easily, like local rice or powdered milk, so I could have my cups of tea. And also for the last 10 years, I've really been using the waste stream around me. So I'll ask people that I know, and actually I've got a bit of a reputation now that when people have things in the back of their cupboards, like old tea or old flour or grains or legumes that they bought with good intentions and never going to use, they can give that to me and then I will use that. Toiletries, that was easy. I mean, I can make my own shampoo with citrus fruit. I can make toothpaste. I use aloe vera for toothpaste. Clothes are easy to come by in our world. We have an absolute abundance of clothes and people often giving them away. What's letting me down now is my teeth. I have bad teeth and I can't actually do anything about that myself. So I am going to take a break from living without money, and I'm going to try to raise some funds to get my teeth fixed. Am I actually living without money? Because no, I don't have any money myself. But, you know, I'm living with people who do have money. So, you know, so that's an area of contention, and fair enough. I don't actually really know the answer to that. I don't believe that it's healthy or good to opt out of our community. So it's about community sufficiency, and we need to build that community. In Lismore, where I live, there's been great examples of that through the disastrous floods that we've been through in the last few years.
Yes,
of community coming together to support one another, and that's where it's at. And so living without money, I live in the gift culture, which is where you do work with community more closely, the people around you, and you share and you give freely, and they will give to you, not necessarily, you know, in exactly the same amount. Like it's not a transactional thing. It's freely giving. Because I'm collapse aware, I think that I need to do my utmost to build community around me and get a lot more food growing in my local community. So I'm doing everything I can to do that. I'm very, very driven about this. I want to help my community to hopefully glide down to a crash, and rather than just hitting a wall, soften the blow a bit. And to do that, we need food in our community. We need a lot more food growing here so that when the trucks stop coming, like they did briefly in 2022 with the floods, we will be able to hopefully survive. Even if I have no other outcome from doing this, I feel like I'm doing the right thing. My values are aligned with my actions, which is a really good feeling.
You're listening to Radical Radio 3CR.
And that was Jo Nemeth, a woman painting a picture of what it's like to live as much as possible without money, which I thought was really interesting because I could hear that she's very sensitive to feeling being trapped in a system, and a system that she doesn't agree with. And I think that's a really legitimate feeling because obviously, you know, we're all living in this economic system that is a extractive capitalist system.
You can see she's trying to minimise her involvement with some of the more negative aspects of the capitalist money system that we have, you know. And I can relate to a lot of that myself.
I thought you could. Yeah. I think it's also good to be clear that the harms that this system does to people and planet, these are human-made distortions, and I think they're distorting the human capacity to cooperate. And we do that cooperation either with or without money in different kinds of economic systems. So I just see money as a tool that amplifies our capacity to cooperate, and I see that this tool has been turned against us. So I really do empathise with her desire to sort of ditch the system, but then I think don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because I would argue that we need to reclaim our monetary system so that they work for us.
You're a big monetary system person. I would like to see her system more widely adopted and less interaction with money in our system. I think that money is used, the way it's used these days is in a competitive way, and that's kind of like it's an attribute of the capitalist system. The people who are making the profits pit us against each other. So
that's a political thing, though. It's not simply a monetary thing.
Well, yeah, but it's a political interpretation of the monetary thing, and like I get what you're saying is that it could be used in a far better way. But
I do think she is modelling like an alternative, especially in modelling alternative skills and relationship building, and this idea of radical homesteading and the gift economy. And I think that sort of thing does build resilience into communities. And I guess, you know, minimising your use of money does go some way to reclaiming control of how your energy and activity gets co-opted. I was interested in how she was talking about the impact of her consumption. So she was talking about these long global supply chains, and I would say in that she did put her finger on one of the great powers of money, which is if money is this way of coordinating activity between people, then it does that not only between people who've never met before, but with people who probably never will meet in the future. So money allows us to coordinate our activity with people who will remain completely unknown to us. And in that respect, I often think about my chicken sandwich that I'm going to have next week, right?
Yeah.
So right now, somebody out there is growing chickens, and somebody out there is killing them and transporting them, and somebody else is cooking them, and somebody else out there is growing the wheat that's going to be made into the bread that's going to be sold in a shop. And all these hundreds of people, go into the supply chain that's going to make my chicken sandwich next week.
Making a very nice chicken sandwich for you. Why would people do that? Why would people make you a really nice chicken sandwich?
They don't even know me, and they don't even care if I get my chicken sandwich or not. But that's the power of money. It coordinates the activity of a complex economy.
I reckon you've set up the two poles of the system here. You've got money as this instrument that could be used to mobilise resources, which, if done in a socially minded way, it could be a marvellous and wonderful thing. Mind you, people did do these sorts of things with non-monetary systems. They understood their responsibilities to a society without the money. The other side of the coin, to coin a phrase, is the profit motive, which is that are they making you a chicken sandwich because they want to be a useful part of society, or are they making you a chicken sandwich because they're greedy and they want to maximise their profit? And there are the two poles.
Yeah, I do think we can harness this energy of the population through money in a much better way. And I wouldn't say that we need to get rid of money. I'd say we need to legislate to have clean supply chains all the way through.
Regulation is what we're talking about.
Yeah. I thought it was also really interesting how Jo was talking about her technique of using the waste stream, because I often dip into the waste stream myself, Kevin.
Okay, so you're saying, are we talking about recycling here? Is this the...
Essentially, yeah. So you remember that time we were walking along and I picked up a plastic tub out of the hard rubbish pile?
Oh, yes, I do. I recall that, yeah.
So that's me dipping into the waste stream, although I'm not doing it to quite the extent that Jo's doing it.
She talks about clothes, though, and I think Australia has a terrible, terrible record on the consumption of clothing. Like there's more than enough clothes out there, and a lot of really good clothes.
Yeah, they're fast fashion. So I often think about how living in a developed country, I have access to a waste stream that has fairly high quality stuff in it, and also how that puts me really into a scavenger role in relation to the economic ecosystem. But I don't think that's a role that undermines the system, because you're also still relying on that system to produce stuff. So I don't think it's a fundamental enough challenge to how we do our production and consumption.
I'm James Juniper. I'm an economist at the University of Newcastle, and you're listening to Radio 3CR.
The other thing that Jo was talking about, I thought she gave a beautiful description of the gift economy. And so gift transactions, they differ from monetized transactions, I think, mostly in the fact that they're not measured precisely. So you do something for me because later on I'll do something for you. That's not measured the way money measures transactions. And of course, we have to remember that money, one of its functions is as a unit of measurement. So it's like a centimetre or an inch. But in both cases, whether it's the gift economy or a more monetised economy, I think in both cases there's still forms of reciprocity that humans have.
I find this an interesting thing. Now, if I'm breaking your train of thought, tell me to shut up and I'll stop interrupting.
I can't reach you to kick you under the table here.
I'll get you a stick. I've had a few interesting transactions recently where I've done something for somebody and doing maintenance and stuff, and they said, how much do you have this? And you sort of go, oh, look, it's not worth charging for, or don't worry about it. And they go, oh, I don't feel right. And I go, well, don't think about it as a direct reciprocal thing. You just do something nice for somebody else down the line. There's always an expectation that they have to give something back. But if we can break that and just sort of make it more universal, like where it's not direct reciprocity, but it's a more universal thing where you're trying to find the right place for the right things, or and share things around. That would change dynamics.
Yeah, I think
dramatically.
You and Jo are sort of kindred spirits in this effort. So
do go on. Sorry.
Well, my other thought was that those of us who live in the more monetised economy, I do think we tend to romanticise the gift economy, because I don't see reciprocity that happens without a monetary system as simply happening because everyone has this extra sense of generosity that's otherwise latent in our society. I just see it as different social structures creating different roles that enable the reciprocity differently. So, for example, Jo's seeing herself as a radical homesteader, but that role does come with a whole bunch of obligations and entitlements that she was describing, and those obligations are what create this other kind of social network around her. Whereas the person who's making my chicken sandwich next week, they've got obligations and responsibilities, but they're channeled through a monetary system.
Yeah, the personal contact is broken, which I guess increases productivity, for want of a better term, but people will do more things which could be useful, but people will also do more things which can be completely useless and destructive. Like if they're motivated for profit or under stress, or they're under the pump because they've got debt.
Well, that's where I come back to thinking that you need your regulation that harnesses this capacity of a monetary system. Yeah. The other thing that I was thinking about with Jo is I don't really think it's fair to judge her by whether she is completely cut off from the monetary system, because that would be requiring her to cut herself off from society in ways which even Indigenous cultures don't do today. They often have a monetary aspect to what they're doing. And so when she's questioned about her need to live with people who are connected to the monetary system, for example, she's living with people who are paying the rent or the mortgage.
Which is essentially everybody else in the world, because like you're going to be pretty isolated if you're going to try and just maintain relationships with people who are doing the same thing as you.
That's right. I think she's taking a really realistic approach to all this. And she also makes a really good point that property laws underpin our need to work for money. And even though she didn't say this, I was thinking, well, this sort of links back to 500 years of capitalism, which began with the enclosures. So there, what we saw then was a time when the peasants were kicked off the land.
Kicked off the commons.
Kicked off the commons.
Yeah.
And so they were separated from their means of subsistence, their actual way of feeding and clothing and housing themselves. And then eventually they were forced into working in the factories and becoming wage slaves. The point is that, again, it's how do we write our property laws? And these days what we could be doing is offering universal basic services,
Yes.
which would harness the collective energy of what we're able to do.
Yeah, commie, yes.
And we would have a different kind of commons, Kevin.
Don't worry, I like communism. Socialism is, we need to change the aura of socialism, which is basically sharing. We're talking about social sharing, the removal of everything being private property, and the commons. And so are parks and beaches. If you're an Australian and you like going to the beach, you're a socialist. And
Yes.
Be proud of yourself.
And she talks about the commons in her need for dental care, right? If we had universal dental care.
Yes, which the Greens have been calling for a long time.
That's right. So imagine the more universal basic services we had, the less reliance we would have on having to have money.
Yes, and that becomes a role of government, doesn't it? The government needs to step in and make these things available so that people like, what was her name?
Jo Nemeth.
Jo Nemeth can live without the pressures of capitalism and profit breathing down her neck.
Yeah, so I thought it was a really interesting example that just gets you thinking of what's possible.
Well, I liked that whole Jo thing. I'd travel in my van and visit Jo because I reckon we could have some good conversations about stuff.
Get in touch with her when you're up in Lismore next, Kevin.
Yeah. And I'm supposed to be heading up the coast now. My plan was to get out of Melbourne when it was cold and go and visit the New South Wales coast where it's beautiful. It's not so beautiful up there at the moment, so I'm kind of glad I'm stuck here in Melbourne. Talking about being stuck, we're stuck for time. We're going to move because Mafalda is coming up next. Hey, thank you for that Jo
Little
thing.
gift
It was good.
to you.
It was nice. Yeah. And like I say, get back to us with any ideas you had on about how come we didn't get wiped out by Costello. Got to go.
See you next time, Kevin. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime, wherever you get your podcasts, or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the Permanent Income Hypothesis, or the Ricardian Equivalence, or Rational Expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.